Well, happy Monday, Blue Starr family. Welcome back to another week and another episode of the Big Things from the Big Story podcast. Of course, I'm Harold. I'm the minister here at Blue Starr. And today I've got with me not Craig, but Josh. How are you doing, Josh?
Doing fantastic, Harold. How are you this morning?
I am really excited to have you here. I thought, week 2, it was going to be a solo week, and I was just going to be staring at the camera all lonely like, but no, not at all. Yesterday I said, hey, you want to be on here? And then you were like, yeah, tomorrow sounds great. So I'm excited. Thanks for being here, man.
Yes, sir.
I really appreciate it.
I'm blessed to be here.
And thank you guys for watching. I think we're on the trajectory to, just make things better this week, hopefully, than last week. Last week I was feeling about 9% functionality with my sickness, and I'm at like 95% this week. So hopefully things are going a little bit better. But here we are in yet another week of accomplishing reading the one-year Bible, 2 weeks in. I was really encouraged on Sunday to hear lots of people coming up to me, telling me about how the process has been going, some of the interesting, weird things. Some people are sharing some of the things they never realized that were in the Old Testament that they saw. And so I'm just really, really encouraged by all the reading that's been happening and how people have been loving it. And again, thank you, Josh, for being here with us this morning.
Yes, sir.
Well, this week, January 12th, we have read Genesis chapter 11 through 27 in the Old Testament this past week, and Matthew chapter 5 through chapter 9 in Matthew. And in the Old Testament, we saw the story of the Tower of Babel was kind of our transition on Monday. And then, of course, we followed the story of Abraham, and that was mainly everything that we saw Abraham and Abraham adjacent this week in the Old Testament. So we see the genealogy from Shem all the way to Abram, and Shem's the son of Noah. And then, of course, we see the story of Abraham and Abram being given the name Abraham. We also see Lot and the story of Sodom and Gomorrah kind of mixed into the Abraham story as that happens at the same time. Some notable things, Abraham and Isaac and Ishmael, the process of really trusting God with the promise that he's given, which is what I'm going to talk about here in a minute. And of course, the test of Abraham's faith with Isaac as the sacrifice. And just some interesting stuff in Abraham's story. I mean, can you imagine Isaac being a kid? Hey, where's the sacrifice, Dad? I see the wood. Where's the sacrifice? And so when we conclude all of that with Sarah and Abraham's death and where they're buried and stuff like that in the Old Testament. So that's the main of the story that we followed this week in the Old Testament. And then in the New Testament, we were in the Sermon on the Mount for most of our reading this week. And then, of course, Jesus goes on to do his ministry work after, I think Andrew, who was the one that said it last night, after the greatest sermon ever given, the Sermon on the Mount from Jesus himself. And so we see Jesus then healing the paralyzed man, the leper, and then calling Matthew is where we will be reading today in January 12th. So Jesus' ministry is starting. It's full blown now from last week when he was baptized to him putting in the work here on earth this week. So it's been really, really interesting. So thank you guys again for reading along with us. If you have comments and things that you found interesting, not only leave a comment on the video or the Facebook post or wherever you're watching this, but we also have a brand new Facebook group that we started yesterday that is hopefully just going to be chock full of things that we're reading, things that we're talking about. There's no wrong thing to put on that group if it comes from our one-year Bible reading. You can just say, hey, this thing's really weird. This thing's really interesting. This is a really cool way that God's doing something. Put anything there. We'd love to hear that, and I'll leave the link for that group that we just made down below for the Big Things Bible reading down below in the description. All right, Josh. Well, since you're my guest today, I'll let you start. What is 1 or 2 or 12 big things that you found in the big story of God this week?
It's as part of what I do as a marriage and family therapist, I really look out a lot for the connections to where the Bible really drives marriage and family. And a part of that, what I found, and that's kind of a little background anyway, what I really found a big deal is with Abraham. So Abraham, thankfully, is very flawed.
Yes.
Because it's a great example of one of the first best examples that we have of where God finds somebody who's flawed to make his message work best. And that gives a lot of us hope. And so as a man, Abraham, the way he leads, it's unique, especially at that time. Because, I mean, he does leave his home.
Yep.
And on the faith of God. And God didn't call just Abram. God called the family. He called him and Sarah.
Mm-hmm.
And Abraham's boldness, for one. And that's one thing as men that we try really hard to do in the face of against the tide of being called toxic, is being bold.
Yeah.
And Abraham does that, and the fact that Abraham is bold against God's wishes, not against God, but he questions God. It's like, hey, is there not somebody that can be saved from Sodom?
Yeah. Yeah, that was such an interesting dynamic, the bargaining almost back and forth.
Yeah.
So many times, like, not to bother you again, Lord. Don't be mad at me now.
And Sodom was not unknown.
Yeah.
You know, Sodom was very much known for its infidelity, for prostitution and whatnot, and for Abraham to still bargain for the sake of the potential of somebody being worth saving.
Yeah.
And that's a bold leadership in the face of the greatest power.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then he continues that faith as not just leaving his homeland, sacrificing, which is what we're called to do as men, just men in general, but also as husbands and fathers, is to sacrifice, is to compromise. And he knows that for the younger generation to thrive, he gives that best land to Lot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And even before that, there's Isaac. You know, complete faith in God, that God's going to keep his promise no matter what this outcome is going to be.
Yeah, absolutely. The story, and Josh and I were just talking about that kind of before we started, but the story of Abraham and Isaac, and just the dynamic of putting your trust in God to sacrifice the promise, which is really an incredible parallel to what God did for us with his son, Jesus. Mm-hmm. And he sacrificed his son for the sake of his plan. That's what Abraham was called to do by God as well, until God stepped in and intervened right in the nick of time. And so like the boldness of Abraham's faith there, you know, you just put it all in comparison to who he is. Mm-hmm. And he's obviously very human, but he also still has great trust in God, which is incredible. It's,
and when I say this part, I'm not trying to like say Abraham is greater than Christ, because God knew from the beginning where he was going to put Christ into our world. Abraham had no idea. There was almost no context except for Noah. There was no context of God, of religion, of organized anything, except whether it was a voice from the sky like Charlton Heston heard. For those of younger out there, Charlton Heston was an older actor. Google that. But whether it was a voice from the heavens shouting down, or whether it was Elijah who heard it in the whisper in the wind. Mm-hmm. You know, it was completely unheard of. Yeah.
Yeah, and Elijah's yet to come, you know, and so, but yeah, and one thing I noticed this time reading through, and I've, read this part of Genesis a ton of times, and the story of Abraham a ton of times, is we always remember that Sarah laughed at God's promise of Isaac and the generations that would come from them, and how she laughed at the fact that they could even have a kid. But I never noticed this, but Abraham laughed in another occasion at that as well. Mm-hmm. And so just the human tendencies we have, and obviously Abraham trusted God. He had great faith, but we find ourselves slipping in the moment of like, yeah, right, that's not going to happen, and doubting God and the things that we say.
Yeah.
And so, I really like the story of Abraham a lot, and that's where I'm going to hang out too. So,
Yes, sir.
you have anything else to add to what you wanted to share this week?
I'm not going to say a whole lot about the Sermon on the Mount. That's always a big one for me. I love it.
Yeah.
Andrew said it really great last night, and the way he laid it out, that the Sermon on the Mount isn't a checklist, but a recognition of seasons of life.
Yeah.
Whether you're poor in spirit, for example, we're not going to be poor in spirit forever. We move on from that, and we understand what like meek is, for example.
Mm-hmm.
And if you go back to into the Greek and find the definition of meek, it's not weak, it's not just soft. It is someone who has made a purposeful decision to maintain self-control.
Yeah.
And be soft when soft is necessary. Be firm when firm is necessary.
Yeah. I always look at it, and I know it's not quite this, but, they humbled themselves to this point.
And humility is a choice.
Yeah, absolutely. And so it's very intentional to be meek. And we talked about this in our table, but the meek will inherit the earth, and the poor in spirit will inherit the kingdom of God. And obviously there's more in the Beatitudes, there's more in the Sermon on the Mount, but just those two specific ones. Courtney was sharing with me last night that how powerful it is thinking about the poor in spirit inheriting the kingdom of God, just with some perspective of there's a lot of religious upbringing, there's a lot of churches that, and I don't mean it in a mean way, but that will bring you up in religion and make you poor in spirit. Mm-hmm. You're not excited about God. He's a just God, and so that means that, of course, he's going to punish you if you don't get it perfectly right. And so you're just trying to follow others, and if they've gotten it enough right, you got it enough right too. And so that creates poor in spirit. But Courtney was talking about how comforting it is that Jesus said, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for they will inherit the kingdom of heaven." Yeah. And it was just a really great perspective. She should have been on here and shared it better than me. But yeah, there's so much good stuff in the Sermon on the Mount. And we just talked about a few verses, the Beatitudes last night at Glow Group. So if you weren't with us, I apologize that you missed that, because it was fantastic stuff.
Yeah. Y'all should come. It's going to be great.
Yeah. Absolutely.
I hear the next week's teacher is super awesome, by the way.
Well, I'm going to talk about Abraham a little bit more. Just again, I reflected on the humanity and some of the, it's almost funny to see how Abraham interacts with God at times. He laughs, he argues over Sodom and Gomorrah, and he trusts God, but there's a lot of humanity there. And in fact, one of my favorite stories is digging in a little bit on January 7th and 8th in Genesis, 18. And this is when Abraham is visited, and he's sitting under the tree, and he sees the three men. I'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. The three men approaching, and he recognizes that they need to come see him and Sarah. And they do, and they give the promise that God has been giving him. He gave this promise 4 times in our reading this week, which I just found really powerful. We always remember, God's promise that you will have offspring like the stars of the sky. God's promise that you will have offspring like the sand beneath your feet. Uncountable, immeasurable things, but God's given that promise 4 times. And here in the third one, when the men come to visit him, they give that promise again, and then they turn and go to Sodom and Gomorrah. And it's interesting because the word of these men that's used over and over again is, one of them is called the Lord, which would be an appropriate title for Abraham to say to anybody that came and visited his home. Yeah. But if you look at the word, and the ESV did a really good job of this, it's in all caps, Lord, in the ESV, because it's really indicating that this is more than just the Lord of a people, the Lord of a family, but this is the Lord. Yeah. And so it's like, okay, that's wild. Abraham's here talking to the Lord and 2 other men in Genesis chapter 18. And so in verse 22, we see that the men turned from there and went to Sodom, and Abraham stood before the Lord. So 2 of the men go away to Sodom and Gomorrah to do what needs to be done. And Abraham's standing there with the Lord. And we later see in 19 verse 1 that the two angels came to Sodom. And I'm like, wait a minute, these two men were actually two angels. And so it's mind-boggling to me looking behind the scenes a little bit. It's like Jesus himself and two angels came to Abraham and Sarah in the desert, in their tent, to give the promise yet again that they will have a son and he will be the father of generations and generations to come. And then Abraham's just there standing, looking over Sodom and Gomorrah, talking to the Lord, to Christ, about rescuing 10 people maybe out of Sodom, right? And so it's really cool to me because we don't often think about Jesus in the Old Testament. He's not in the Old Testament. He comes in the New Testament, right? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. He's coming in the New Testament. But I think there's a lot of really cool little indicators throughout the Old Testament that Father, Son, and Holy Spirit have all been here throughout the entire time. And so I find that really, really cool. And of course, the power behind the promise that is given to Abraham over and over again is that he will have offspring and there will come generations and generations. And we read last week in Matthew, the lineage of Jesus through his father Joseph that starts with Abraham. So that's pretty cool. So we get to see that the genealogy, the lineage, the nations that are coming from Abraham, this is all pointing back to Jesus being born on earth. So it's just full circle. And I think that's really, really cool. So I get a little nerdy about that. But yeah, January 7th and 8th, Genesis 18 and 19, I found very, very fascinating this week.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And this, the way that God just continuously reaffirms that this covenant's really happening.
Yeah.
It's when you were talking about that, and this, forgive me if it sounds like a slight. Your daughter is quite young.
Yeah.
I'm a good, I want to say minimum 20 years older than you.
Sure.
My older son is 19 in college. I love him. Everyone here knows I love my son to death. I'm quite proud of him. But listening to, and in the reading, Abraham talking to God, it's like my son talking to me. He has full faith that I'm looking out for him, and no matter how upset he might get with me, he knows that in the end, I'm always going to be looking out for him. I'm always going to hold up my end of being a dad.
Yeah, absolutely.
And his faith in me is unwavering, but yet he's always questioning. He's always pushing the line. He's always looking for not an angle, but I was looking for a better perception. Excuse me. And to me, it's fascinating seeing the parallels. It's like, wow, we're watching a 100-year-old child talking to the eternal of all fathers.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's almost like a teenager that thinks he might just know better. You know,
that's right.
he knows he doesn't, but he also thinks he kind of does. And yeah, that's kind of the vibe I get from especially when Abraham is going back and forth with God over Sodom and Gomorrah. It's maybe we should be challenged to have that boldness with God and still keep him as Lord and ruler and Father, but also not be afraid to be like, hey, is this really what you want? Is this, like, is there another way? Because he'll show us the way. There's no doubt about that. Just like he still had to show Abraham that, Sodom and Gomorrah were going to be destroyed. Even if there was 10, there wasn't. And so thanks for going back and forth with me, but we didn't get there, and so
faith like a child.
Yeah, absolutely. So what are some things that you guys noticed this week? Again, there's way more in 1 week's reading than we could ever talk about in 10 or 15 minutes, even more than we could post in the comments. So join us on our new Facebook group. I think there'll be a lot of good stuff happening in there in the next couple of weeks, and it'll be really helpful for the podcast as well. Maybe looking at some of the things you guys found interesting. The big things you saw will help us talk about big things here on the podcast.
Yes, sir.
Well, Josh, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you, Harold. I appreciate you having me.
I was telling Josh last night, it's okay to do a podcast by yourself, but you kind of just feel weird because you're talking to a wall. There's nobody there, but it helps a lot to have somebody sitting next to you. So
absolutely.
Thank you again for being here. We will see you guys again next week. In fact, I think it'll be Craig next week with another episode of the Big Things from the Big Story podcast. So make sure and join us here on all the Blue Star pages on Monday, sometime next week, and we would love to hear what you saw in the reading in the One Year Bible this week. See you next time, guys.